Welcome to Vesper Shroud, the place where shadows linger a little too long and the silence carries stories no one dares to tell. Tonight, we're heading north, deep into Alaska, a land where beauty and terror walk side by side. Out here, the nights stretch endlessly, the forests swallow sound, and the cold isn't the only thing creeping under your skin. Locals whisper about things they've seen on frozen highways, strange lights in the sky, and figures moving just beyond the tree line. These aren't fairy tales. These are true accounts, handed down through hushed voices, first-hand encounters, and legends that refuse to die. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Now, settle in, keep the lights low, and remember, Alaska hides more than just snow. Let's begin. Story 1. Staircase. I found the staircase on my third day alone in the Wrangell Mountains, and I should have turned back the moment I saw it. But you have to understand something first. When you spend enough time in the Alaskan wilderness, you start believing you know what belongs and what doesn't. A moose track in fresh snow. The distant crack of ice on a frozen lake. The weight of silence that presses down on you when the wind stops. These things make sense. They fit the pattern of a place where nature still operates by rules older than human memory. A wooden staircase in the middle of nowhere does not fit that pattern. I was hiking off trail, following a ridge line that most people never see. The snow was deep that February, nearly 3 feet in places, and my GPS had stopped working 2 hours earlier. Not dead batteries, just stopped. The screen flickered with static patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like symbols. I told myself it was the cold. Electronics fail in extreme temperatures. That's what I told myself. The staircase appeared in a clearing between 2 massive spruce trees. Not old and rotted like you might expect. Not weathered gray by decades of mountain storms. The wood looked fresh, maintained. The handrails were smooth under my gloved hand when I reached out to touch them, as if someone had sanded them recently. Each step was exactly the same height, the same depth. Perfectly uniform. The kind of craftsmanship you see in expensive homes. Not in a forest where the temperature drops to 30 below zero. It led straight up into the white sky. I counted 40 steps before the angle made it impossible to see where it ended. Maybe it didn't. The end? That thought came to me unbidden, and I pushed it away. Everything ends somewhere. Staircases go from point A to point B. They have a purpose, a destination. This one had to lead somewhere. The temperature was already 15 below when I started climbing. The first few steps felt normal. My boots crunched against packed snow that had somehow accumulated on the treads overnight. The handrail stayed solid under my grip. Behind me, my footprints marked a trail back to sanity, back to the normal world where staircases exist for reasons. At step 20, I noticed the cold intensifying. Not gradually, not the way temperature shifts when you gain elevation or when the sun drops behind a mountain. This was immediate and aggressive. Between one step and the next, the air temperature plummeted at least 10 degrees. My breath came out in thick clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. The moisture in my nostrils froze instantly, and my eyes started watering from the sudden shock of Arctic air. I should have stopped. Every instinct I had developed over 15 years of wilderness hiking screamed at me to turn around. But something else pushed me forward. Curiosity, maybe. Or something worse. The need to understand. The human compulsion to solve mysteries even when solving them might destroy you. At step 40, I looked back. The ground was gone. Not hidden by clouds or distance. Gone. The staircase descended behind me into a white void that my eyes could not penetrate. My footprints had vanished. The spruce trees had vanished. The entire forest had been erased by something that was not quite fog and not quite snow. It moved with intention, swirling in patterns that seemed to avoid the staircase itself while consuming everything around it. I was standing on a wooden structure suspended in nothingness, and the only direction left to go was up. The temperature kept dropping. My thermometer read 40 below zero, then 50. Then the digital display flickered and died just like my GPS. The cold penetrated every layer of my expensive winter gear. It found gaps I didn't know existed. My fingers went numb despite the insulated gloves. My feet felt like blocks of ice inside boots rated for extreme conditions. But I kept climbing because going back meant descending into that void, and something about the void felt worse than whatever waited above. At step 70, I felt the breathing. Not heard it, felt it, a rhythmic pressure against my back, as if something large was exhaling just inches behind my neck. The breath was colder than the air around me. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather or elevation. It was the cold of deep space, of the gaps between stars, of places where warmth had never existed and never would. I didn't turn around. Some primitive part of my brain understood that turning around would be a mistake, that seeing what breathed behind me would break something fundamental in my mind. So I climbed faster, taking steps 2 at a time, my lungs burning from the frozen air, my heart hammering against my ribs. The staircase kept going, 90 steps, 100, 120. I had climbed higher than any staircase had a right to be, higher than most buildings. The wood never creaked, never groaned under my weight. It absorbed sound rather than producing it, creating a bubble of unnatural silence around me. At step 150, I noticed the carvings. They covered the handrails in intricate patterns that I had somehow missed before. Not decorative flourishes, not the kind of designs you find on furniture or architecture. These were symbols that hurt to look at directly. My eyes kept sliding off them, unable to focus, unable to process what they were seeing. But in my peripheral vision, they almost made sense, almost formed words in a language I had never learned but somehow recognized. The carvings moved. I watched them shift and rearrange themselves on the wood, flowing like water, forming new combinations that created new meanings. And with each new pattern, I understood more. Not through translation, not through logic. The understanding simply appeared in my mind fully formed, like someone was placing thoughts directly into my consciousness. The staircase was old, not decades old, not centuries old, old in a way that predated human civilization. It had been here before the mountains rose, before the ice came and went and came again, before Alaska was Alaska. The wood was not wood. The structure was not a structure. It was something else wearing the shape of a staircase the way a hunter might wear camouflage. It was a pathway to somewhere humans were never meant to go. The breathing behind me intensified. I could feel it on my exposed skin now, on my face and neck. The cold burned like fire. Ice crystals formed on my eyelashes, making it harder to see. Each breath I took scraped my throat raw. My body was shutting down, cell by cell, surrendering to a cold that existed outside the laws of thermodynamics. At step 200, I saw the top. A platform, maybe 10 feet square, made of the same impossible wood. And standing in the center of that platform was a door. Not attached to anything. No frame, no walls. Just a door standing upright in midair, defying gravity and logic. It was made of dark wood that seemed to absorb light. No handle, no hinges visible from my angle. But carved into its surface were more of those symbols, thousands of them, covering every inch in layers upon layers of meaning that my mind could not fully process. I stopped climbing 5 steps from the top. The breathing was directly behind me now, close enough that if I leaned back even an inch, I would touch whatever stood there. The cold radiating from it made the ambient temperature feel tropical by comparison. It was a cold that killed not just bodies but thoughts, memories, the very concept of warmth. And I understood with absolute certainty that if I stepped onto that platform, if I opened that door, I would see something that would change me in ways I could not imagine or survive. That door led somewhere true, somewhere that made our reality look like a paper cutout, a place where the rules that govern existence were different, were wrong, were incompatible with human consciousness. But I also understood that I could not go back down. The void below had solidified into something worse than emptiness, something with mass and hunger and intelligence. The staircase had been a trap from the beginning, baited with human curiosity, designed to draw travelers to exactly this point. This choice. Open the door and be transformed into something else. Or stay here and freeze while something unseen breathed against my neck until my body stopped functioning. I chose a third option. I stepped off the staircase, not down into the void, sideways, off the edge into the space beside the structure. I didn't default. The moment my foot left the wood, the illusion shattered. The staircase vanished. The door vanished. The breathing stopped. I was standing on a mountain ridge in the Wrangell Range, surrounded by spruce trees and deep snow. My GPS flickered back to life. The temperature was 15 below zero, normal for a February afternoon. The sun was exactly where it should be in the sky, but I was standing 50 feet from where I had started climbing. 50 feet of horizontal distance that I had covered by walking vertically. And in the snow at my feet was a single wooden step, half buried in ice, rotting and ancient and wrong. I ran back to my camp. I packed everything in record time. I hiked the 12 miles back to my truck in 4 hours, barely stopping to catch my breath. I drove to the nearest town and didn't to stop shaking for 3 days. They tried to find that ridge again. They studied maps, satellite images, geological surveys. They interviewed other hikers they explored the Wrangell Wilderness. Nobody has seen a staircase. Nobody has felt that cold. Nobody has encountered a door standing alone in the sky. But sometimes, late at night, I feel that breathing again. That cold that comes from outside our universe. And I wonder if stepping off the staircase really saved me, or if I just delayed something inevitable. If choosing neither option still counts as making a choice. I wonder what stands at the top of staircases I cannot see, in places I'll never go, waiting for other travelers who make different decisions. And I wonder if the door ever opens on its own. So here is my question for you. If you found that staircase, if you climbed to the top and saw that door, what would you do? Would you open it? Would you step off? Would you stay and freeze? Write your answer in the comments. Tell me what you choose, because part of me thinks our choices were already made the moment we started climbing. That the staircase knows something about us we don't know about ourselves. And maybe your answer will tell you something about who you really are when every option leads to darkness. Story 2. Smell that changes reality. The smell hit me like a wall, sweet and rotten at the same time. And when I looked up, the snow-covered spruce trees had transformed into dripping tropical palms with something massive moving between them. My name is Chris Dalton. I am a wilderness guide on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. Been doing it for 15 years. I know these forests like I know my own house. Every trail, every ridgeline, every frozen creek. They guided hundreds of tourists through backcountry that would kill them without someone who knows what they're redoing. I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at me. I was wrong. It happened on a February afternoon. I was leading a group of 4 clients on a winter camping trip. Experienced outdoors people from Seattle. They wanted the real Alaska experience. 3 days in the wilderness. Temperatures hovering around 20 below. No heated shelters, just tents and sleeping bags and the kind of cold that makes you understand how fragile humans really are. We were 2 days in, about 15 miles from the nearest road. The landscape was what you'd expect. Snow covered everything, bare deciduous trees, dark green spruce and hemlock. Mountains in the distance, sky the color of old ice. Beautiful in that harsh, unforgiving way Alaska specializes in. Then the smell arrived. It came from nowhere. One moment the air was clean and sharp with cold. The next, I was breathing in something thick and organic. Sweet like overripe mangoes. Rotten like compost. Humid like a greenhouse. It was so out of place in the frozen forest that my brain couldn't process it at first. The clients smelled it too. I saw them react, wrinkling their noses, looking around. One woman asked if we were near a hot spring. I said no. The nearest thermal features were 50 miles away. This smell was something else. Then the world changed. The snow beneath my boots became dark earth. Rich, loamy, warm. I could feel the warmth through my insulated boots. The spruce trees in front of me stretched and shifted. Their needles became broad leaves. Their trunks thickened and grew bark that looked like it belonged in Indonesia or Brazil. Vines appeared, hanging between branches. Flowers bloomed in colors that hurt to look at. I blinked, shook my head. The forest flickered. For a moment, I saw both versions at once. The real Alaska wilderness and this impossible tropical jungle occupying the same space. Like 2 photographs overlaid imperfectly. One of my clients screamed. A man named Derek. He was pointing at something in the trees. I followed his gaze and saw movement. Something large. Not a bear. Not a moose. Something that moved wrong. Too fluid. Too fast. It flowed between the phantom trees like liquid, leaving no tracks in the snow that I could still partially see beneath the hallucination. The smell intensified. Now it was overwhelming. Choking. I felt dizzy. My vision swam. The tropical forest became more solid. More real. The Alaskan winter faded like a dream I was waking from. I could hear things now. Sounds that had no place in an Arctic forest. Bird calls. Not ravens or ptarmigan. These were exotic. Harsh. Layered over each other in a cacophony that suggested hundreds of species. Insect sounds too. Buzzing and clicking and humming. And underneath it all, something else. Something that might have been breathing or might have been wind through leaves that shouldn't exist. My clients were panicking. I needed to get them out. Get them moving. Distance from whatever was causing this. But which direction was real? The trail I'd been following was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth that looked impassable. Yet when I forced my eyes to focus, to see past the hallucination, I could still make out the snow. The real trees, The actual path. I grabbed the nearest client, a woman named Sarah, and pulled her toward what I hoped was the trail. She resisted. She was staring at something I couldn't see. Her eyes were wide. Her mouth was open. She looked terrified and fascinated at the same time. I shook her, yelled her name. She didn't respond. Just kept staring. I looked where she was looking and saw it too. A clearing in the jungle that shouldn't be there. And in that clearing, structures. Not buildings exactly, more like organic sculptures, twisted shapes that might have been grown rather than built. They pulsed, expanded and contracted like they were breathing. The other 3 clients were moving toward the clearing, walking like they were in a trance. I yelled at them to stop. They didn't even turn around, just kept walking through snow that looked like mud, past trees that flickered between spruce and palm, toward structures that couldn't exist. I made a decision. I dropped my pack and ran after them. The smell was so thick now it felt like I was breathing soup. Each breath made the hallucination stronger, made the jungle more real, made the cold Alaskan air feel humid and warm. I caught Derek first, tackled him, dragged him backward. He fought me, strong, desperate, like I was pulling him away from something he needed to reach. I got him 20 feet back and the spell broke. He collapsed, started sobbing, asked me what the hell that place was. I didn't have an answer. I went back for the others, got Sarah next, then Mike, but the 4th client, a man named Paul, had reached the clearing. He was standing at the edge, reaching toward one of the pulsing structures, and the structure was reaching back. I saw it extend something. Not an arm, not a tentacle, something between the two. It was the same color as the hallucination, that oversaturated tropical green that hurt your eyes. It wrapped around Paul's wrist. He didn't pull away, didn't scream, just stood there, smiling. I ran toward him, but the smell intensified to the point where I couldn't breathe. I fell to my knees. The world spun. When my vision cleared, Paul was gone. The clearing was empty. The hallucination was fading. The smell was dissipating. Within minutes, the forest was back to normal. Cold, snowy, real. The only evidence that anything had happened was Paul, his pack lying in the snow, and 3 traumatized clients who could barely speak. We searched for Paul. I radioed for help. Search and rescue came. They brought dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging. They searched for 3 days. Found nothing. No tracks. No sign of struggle. No body. Paul had simply vanished in the middle of a snow-covered forest with 4 witnesses who couldn't explain what had happened. The authorities thought we were lying, or that we killed him. We were questioned for hours. Our stories didn't match perfectly because we each seen slightly different versions of the hallucination. Derek swore he saw creatures with too many legs. Sarah saw faces in the trees. Mike saw the structures as temples. I saw them as something organic and alive. Eventually, they let us go. Lack of evidence. No body. No crime scene. Just a missing person and 4 people with a story no one believed. I researched after that. Found stories going back decades. The phantom smell on the Kenai Peninsula. It appeared sporadically, maybe once every few years. Always in winter. Always in remote areas. And people disappeared. Not every time, but sometimes. 1 or 2 people who were there one moment and gone the next. Always with witnesses who described impossible tropical visions in the snow. The local Dina Ina tribe had stories about it. They called it something that translates roughly to the smell that shows the underneath. They believed that reality was thin in certain places. That underneath our world was another world. Older, stranger, full of things that should never be seen. And sometimes, in winter when the barriers were weakest, that underneath world would push through. The smell was the warning. The hallucination was the bleeding over. And if you got too close, if you let the underneath touch you, you'd be pulled in. Taken to a place that wasn't quite another dimension and wasn't quite a dream. Something in between. I stopped guiding in that area. Couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk leading more clients into something I didn't understand and couldn't protect them from. But the smell found me again. 3 months after Paul disappeared, I was at home in Soldotna. Safe, warm, 40 miles from where the incident happened. I woke up at 3 a.m. smelling it. That sweet, rotten, humid smell. In my bedroom, in my house, I opened my eyes and saw my ceiling covered in vines. Flowers blooming in the darkness. Insects crawling across surfaces that were still my walls but also something else. And in the corner of my room, one of those pulsing structures. Small, maybe 3 feet tall, but growing, expanding, breathing. I ran. Got outside, the smell followed. I drove, headed south, away from the Kenai, away from whatever was trying to break through. The smell faded after an hour. When I returned the next day, my house was normal. Nothing strange, nothing out of place, but I found something on my bedroom floor. A seed, large, black, covered in tiny barbs. I'd never seen anything like it. It didn't match any Alaskan plant I knew. I sent it to a botanist at the university. She couldn't identify it either. Said it resembled certain tropical species, but with significant differences. Mutations that shouldn't occur naturally. She wanted to plant it, see what grew. I told her to destroy it. I don't know if she did. The smell has come 3 more times since then. Always at night. Always when I'm alone. Each time the hallucination is stronger. More detailed. More real. Each time it takes longer to fade. And each time I see more of what is underneath our world. More of those structures. More of those things moving in the phantom jungle. And they see me too. I know they see me. I can feel their attention. Their interest. Their hunger. I am leaving Alaska. Moving to Arizona. Desert. Heat. As far from the Kenai Peninsula as I can get while staying in America. Maybe distance will help. Maybe the underneath can to reach me there. Maybe the smell is tied to this place and one to follow. But I don't think that is true. I think once you smell it, once you see the underneath, it knows you. It's marked you. And eventually, it will come for you no matter where you go. The smell will find you. The hallucination will trap you. And you will walk into that clearing like Paul did. Smiling, reaching, letting something that shouldn't exist pull you into a place that shouldn't be real. I found something yesterday that confirmed my fears. A news article from Tucson, Arizona. 2 hikers disappeared in the Catalina Mountains. Their friend survived. She described a strange smell, sweet and rotten, and tropical plants appearing in the desert, and structures that pulsed and breathed. It is not just Alaska. It is everywhere. Anywhere reality is thin. Anywhere the underneath can push through. The smell is spreading. The hallucinations are becoming more common, and more people are disappearing. I think something is waking up. Something old. Something that existed before humans, before animals, before anything we recognize as life. It has been sleeping underneath our reality. And now it is stirring, pushing through, testing the barriers, looking for weak points, looking for people who can smell it, people who can see it, people it can pull through. I don't know why I chose Paul. I don't know why it keeps visiting me. But I know I'm running out of time. The hallucinations are lasting longer. The smell is getting stronger. My grip on what is real is weakening. Soon I want to be able to tell the difference between the snow and the jungle. Between Alaska and the underneath. Between here and there. When that happens, I'll walk into the clearing. I'll reach toward those pulsing structures. And I'll reach back. And I'll disappear like Paul did, like all the others did. Taken to a place that has always been underneath. Waiting. Patient. Hungry. The worst part is I am starting to want it. The smell used to disgust me. Now it smells sweet, inviting, like home. The hallucination used to terrify me. Now it fascinates me. The structures that pulse and breathe used to seem alien. Now they seem beautiful, necessary, like they were showing me something important, something true, something I need to understand. I am changing. The smell is changing me, making me compatible with the underneath, preparing me for the transfer. I can feel it happening. My thoughts aren't quite my own anymore. My dreams are full of tropical forests and creatures that move wrong in that clearing where Paul stood smiling. I am writing this as a warning. If you smell something sweet and rotten in a place where that smell doesn't belong, run. Don, to investigate. Don, to breathe deeply. Don, to try to understand. Just run. Get away as fast as you can. Because once you smell it, once you see the underneath, it sees you too. And it won. They stop until it has you. Paul is still alive. I know that somehow. He is not dead. He is just elsewhere. In the underneath. In that tropical fever dream that exists in the spaces between reality. And part of me envies him. Part of me wants to follow. Part of me is already planning to go back to that spot in the Kenai where he disappeared. To wait for the smell. To let the hallucination take me. To walk into that clearing and reach out and let the underneath have what it wants. I want and fight it much longer. I can. The smell is calling. The underneath is waiting. And I'm so tired of resisting. If you ever smell it, would you run? Or would you stay to see what is underneath our reality? Would you resist or would you let it take you? Tell me in the comments what you do, because I am not sure I have a choice anymore. Story 3. Screaming coral. The coral was screaming when I held it up to the microphone. Not loudly, not in any frequency a human ear could detect without amplification. But when I played back the recording through my studio monitors, there it was. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, all screaming at once in perfect, terrible harmony. I am a marine biologist, 44 years old, been studying Alaska, its coastal ecosystems for 19 years. My name is David Chen, and in February of 1996, I was contracted by the University of Alaska to investigate an unusual phenomenon on Kodiak Island. Black coral was washing up on the beaches, miles of it, covering the shoreline in dark, branching structures that looked more like burned wood than any coral I'd ever seen. Coral doesn't grow in Alaska waters. The temperatures are too cold, the conditions too harsh. But here it was, tons of it, piling up on every beach from Chiniak Bay to Passagshak Point. The locals were disturbed by it, said it appeared overnight after a storm, said the beaches had been clear one day and covered the next. They wanted it gone. It smelled wrong, they said. Made them feel sick to be near it. I arrived on Kodiak on February 8th with a small research team. 2 graduate students, Jenny and Mark, both in their 20s, both eager to make their mark in marine biology. We set up our equipment in a rented cabin near Chiniak and started collecting samples the first morning. The coral was unlike anything in the scientific literature. The structure was correct, the branching patterns consistent with coral growth. But the material was wrong. Too dense, too dark. And when I examined a cross-section under magnification, I saw something that made me question my equipment. The internal structure looked like neural tissue. Not similar to neural tissue, identical. I could see structures that resembled neurons, synapses, axons. The branching patterns matched human brain architecture. I thought my microscope was contaminated, that I was somehow looking at tissue from my own skin cells. But I cleaned everything, prepared new samples, and got the same results. This coral, if it even was coral, had grown structures identical to human nervous system components. Jenny suggested we try recording it. She was studying bioacoustics, the sounds marine life produces, and she brought sensitive recording equipment. She said some corals produce sounds during spawning or stress responses, ultrasonic clicks and pops that require special equipment to detect. Maybe this coral would do the same. We set up our recording gear in the cabin that night, placed a large piece of the coral, maybe 2 feet of branching structure, on the table surrounded by microphones. Started recording, and for the first hour, nothing. Just ambient noise. The wind outside, the cabin settling, our own breathing. Then, at around 11:30, the equipment started picking up something. Faint at first, a low-frequency hum that gradually increased in volume and complexity. Jenny adjusted the filters, amplified the signal. And that is when we heard it. Voices, human voices, screaming. Not one voice, not a dozen, hundreds of them, maybe more, all compressed into that single piece of coral, all screaming in agony or terror or something beyond either emotion. The sound was layered, dense, each voice distinguishable but also part of a larger collective cry. And underneath the screaming was something else. A rhythm, a pattern, like the voices were trying to form words but couldn't quite manage it. Mark thought it was interference, radio signals or some kind of electromagnetic artifact. But Jenny's equipment was shielded, designed to filter out exactly that kind of contamination. And the sound was too organic, too human. I listened to it for 3 hours, letting the recording loop, and I started to recognize patterns. Certain voices repeating, certain screams rising above the others, then fading back into the collective. We collected more samples the next morning. Different pieces of coral from different beaches. All of them produced the same results under microscopy. All of them contained those neural structures. And when we recorded them, they all screamed. Each piece had its own voice, its own collective of screaming, but they were similar enough to suggest they came from the same source. I sent samples and recordings to colleagues at other universities, marine biologists, neurologists, acoustic specialists. Everyone was baffled. The consensus was that this couldn't be natural, that it had to be some kind of contamination or hoax. But none of them could explain how. The neural structures were too complex, too perfect, the screaming too consistent, and the sheer volume of coral, miles of coastline covered, made any kind of artificial creation impossible. On day 5, we found the source. We'd been tracking the coral distribution, mapping which beaches had the heaviest deposits, and the pattern pointed to a specific area offshore, a deep trench about 8 miles out, where the seafloor dropped to over 2,000 feet. The storm that had preceded the coral's appearance had come from that direction, and tide patterns suggested the coral was still washing up from that location. We chartered a boat and went out to investigate. The weather was brutal, snow and wind, but the captain was experienced and the boat was solid. We reached the coordinates around noon and started taking depth soundings, looking for anything unusual on the seafloor. The sonar returns were wrong. Instead of the expected rock and sediment, we were getting readings that suggested organic mass. Dense, complex structures covering hundreds of square feet of seafloor. And the structures were shaped wrong, organized in patterns that looked almost architectural, like something had built them. We deployed an underwater camera, a deep sea rig that could handle the pressure and cold. The cables spooled out, the camera descending through dark water, and we watched the live feed on our monitor. For the first few hundred feet, nothing but empty water. Then the coral came into view. It covered everything. The entire seafloor was carpeted in that black, branching coral, growing in formations that rose 20 feet or more. But it wasn't growing randomly. It was organized. The coral formed structures that looked like buildings, walls, corridors. And in the spaces between the coral branches, we saw something that made my blood freeze. Bodies, human bodies, hundreds of them, suspended in the coral like flies in amber, their limbs wrapped in the black branches, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. They were perfectly preserved, no decay despite what should have been months or years in the water. And they were still there, still conscious. I could see their eyes moving, their mouths working, trying to scream. The coral wasn't just coral. It was transforming them, growing through them, replacing their neural tissue with its own structures. They were becoming part of the collective, their consciousness absorbed into the coral, their screams recorded in the material itself. I pulled the camera up immediately. We needed to leave, needed to report this, needed to get authorities involved. But as we started heading back to shore, Jenny noticed something. The coral samples we brought on the boat were moving. Not growing, moving. The branches were orienting themselves, all pointing in the same direction. Toward us. We threw them overboard, but it was too late. The coral knew we found its source. It had become aware of our presence. And that night, back in our cabin, things started happening that made me question my sanity. The coral samples we left behind, the ones still in the cabin for research, started screaming louder. No equipment needed now. We could hear them with our naked ears. A low, resonant sound that vibrated through the walls and floor. And the voices were different, more focused, more directed. They were screaming words now. Our names. Screaming our names over and over. Mark broke first. He'd been the skeptical one, the rational scientist who kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation. But the sound of hundreds of voices screaming his name from inside pieces of coral broke something in him. He grabbed all the samples and ran outside, throwing them as far as he could into the snow. But even after they were gone, we could still hear the screaming. Fainter, but still there, coming from the direction of the beach. We went down to investigate. The tide was out, and the beach was covered in coral. But it had changed. The pieces were no longer scattered randomly. They were arranged, organized into patterns. And those patterns formed letters. Words. A message written in coral across hundreds of feet of beach. You found U.S. Now you, part of U.S. We ran back to the cabin, packed everything we could carry, and drove to the airport. We needed to leave Kodiak, needed to get back to the mainland where there was distance and safety and people who could help. But at the airport, we found more coral. Small pieces, just a few branches, placed carefully on the hood of our rental car. And when Jenny picked one up to throw it away, it latched onto her hand. The coral moved like it was alive, wrapping around her fingers, burrowing into her skin. She screamed and tried to pull it off, but it held tight, the branches piercing through her palm and wrist. Mark and I finally ripped it free, but the damage was done. Black lines were spreading under her skin, following her veins up her arm. The coral was inside her now, growing, reaching toward her brain. We got her to the hospital in Kodiak. The doctors were baffled. They'd never seen an infection like this. They tried antibiotics, antivirals, even talked about amputation. But the coral was spreading too fast, already past her elbow, creeping toward her shoulder. And Jenny was changing. Her personality was fragmenting, becoming multiple voices, multiple consciousnesses trying to speak through her mouth at once. She died 3 days later, but death didn't stop the transformation. The coral kept growing, breaking through her skin, spreading across the hospital bed. And from her body came that sound. Screaming, her voice joined with all the others, absorbed into the collective. The hospital quarantined the room. The Centers for Disease Control got involved. They sent a team to Kodiak to investigate, and I told them everything. Showed them the recordings, the microscopy results, the underwater footage. They listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to horror as the evidence mounted. They sealed off the affected beaches, declared them environmental hazards, started a cleanup operation that involved burning tons of coral and disposing of the ashes in sealed containers. But I knew it was pointless. The source was still out there, still growing on the seafloor, still transforming whatever poor souls had ended up in its embrace. I left Kodiak and never went back. The CDC classified the incident, buried the research, threatened anyone involved with legal action if we discussed it publicly. The official story was a toxic algae bloom that caused hallucinations and skin reactions. Nothing about coral, nothing about the bodies, nothing about the screaming, but I kept copies of everything. The recordings, the photos, the microscopy slides, and I've spent the last 28 years trying to understand what we found. My best theory is that the coral is a form of colonial organism, something that evolved to absorb neural tissue and incorporate consciousness into its structure. The bodies we saw weren't recent drowning victims. They were people who had been missing for years, decades, maybe centuries. All of them absorbed, preserved, kept conscious inside the coral. And the coral is spreading. They tracked reports from other Alaskan coastal areas, strange black growths washing up on beaches, people reporting hearing voices near the water, swimmers who disappear and are never found. The pattern is consistent with the coral expanding its range, sending out spores or fragments to establish new colonies. Mark disappeared 6 years ago. He'd been obsessed with the coral. Couldn't let it go. He returned to Kodiak against my warnings, said he needed to see if it was still there. His rental car was found abandoned near Chiniak Bay. No body, no evidence of what happened. But I know, the coral took him, added him to its collection. I still have one sample, a small piece, barely an inch long, kept in a sealed container in my home office. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and hold it. And I hear them, all those voices, all those trapped consciousnesses, screaming their eternal scream, begging for release that will never come. And now, I'm starting to see the black lines under my own skin. Started in my left hand 2 months ago, spreading slowly up my arm. I must have been exposed during those initial collections, the coral infiltrating my system so gradually I never noticed until it was too late. Soon, I'll join the collective, my consciousness absorbed into the screaming mass, my voice added to the chorus. So here's what I need to know. What haunts my final days? If you discovered that consciousness could be preserved indefinitely, that death wasn't truly an end but a transformation into something collective and eternal, would you see it as horror or transcendence? Would you run from it like I did, or embrace it as Mark eventually chose to? Let me know in the comments, because in a few months, I'll have my answer whether I want it or not. The coral is patient, the coral is eternal, and the coral always adds to its collection. The screaming never stops, and soon, I'll understand exactly what all those voices are trying to say. If the night feels closer now, don't worry, you're not alone. Subscribe and hit the bell so the next shadow finds you. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? The dark connects us more than you think. Story 4, Whistling Minds. What would you do if you lost 3 days of your life and woke up with frostbite in the shape of handprints? Handprints that could not have been made by human hands. That is what happened to me in the winter of 2019, in an abandoned copper mine near Kennecott, Alaska. And what I am about to tell you will make you understand why some places should stay abandoned forever. My name is Jack Pearson. I am a freelance photographer, 46 years old, and I have spent the last 20 years documenting forgotten America. Ghost towns, abandoned factories, places where history went to die. I have seen a lot of strange things, but nothing prepared me for Kennecott. Nothing prepared me for the whistling. I arrived in early February. The town of Kennecott is not really a town anymore, just a collection of buildings left over from the copper boom that ended in 1938. The mining company pulled out overnight, leaving everything behind. Tools still hung on walls. Papers still sat on desks. It was like everyone had simply vanished in the middle of a workday. The National Park Service maintains some of the structures now, but most of it sits there in the snow, slowly rotting, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. I had planned to spend a week photographing the ruins. I rented a small cabin on the edge of what used to be the town, packed enough food for 10 days, and brought my cold weather gear. The temperature was hovering around -20, and the sun barely made it above the mountains before setting again. Perfect conditions for the kind of stark, haunting images I wanted to capture. On my first day, I explored the main buildings, the hospital, the general store, the bunkhouses where workers had slept 100 years ago. Everything was covered in a thick layer of frost, and my breath hung in the air like smoke. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the snow and the distant creak of old wood settling under the weight of ice. That is when I heard it, a whistling sound, faint and musical, coming from somewhere to the north. It rose and fell in pitch, almost like a song, but with no melody I could recognize. I followed it through the snow, past collapsed structures and rusted equipment, until I reached the entrance to one of the old mine shafts. The opening was maybe 6 feet wide, braced with rotting timber that looked like it could collapse at any moment. A chain stretched across the entrance with a sign that read, "Danger, do not enter." But the whistling was coming from inside, echoing up from the darkness, clear and impossibly loud. I am not an idiot. I know better than to go into an abandoned mine alone. But something about that sound pulled at me. It felt familiar, like a song I had heard in childhood but could not quite place. I told myself I would just look inside, just take a few photos from the entrance, and then leave. I stepped over the chain and turned on my headlamp. The shaft descended at a steep angle, the walls slick with ice, the floor covered in a mixture of snow and ancient mud. The whistling grew louder as I moved deeper, reverberating off the stone, filling my head until it was the only thing I could hear. My hands started to go numb despite my gloves, and I noticed my breath was not forming clouds anymore. The air was too cold, colder than it should have been, colder than anything natural. About 50 feet down, I found the first body. It was not recent. The corpse was frozen solid, perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures. A man, maybe in his 30s, wearing modern winter gear. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his mouth was stretched wide in what might have been a scream or a laugh. But what terrified me most were his hands. They were black with frostbite, and the pattern was wrong. The frozen tissue formed shapes on his palms and fingers, symbols that looked almost deliberate, like someone had branded him with ice. I should have run. I should have climbed back up that shaft and called the authorities. But the whistling had changed. It sounded less like wind through stone and more like voices now, dozens of them, singing in harmony. And they were singing my name. I kept going deeper. The shaft opened into a larger chamber, maybe 30 feet across, the ceiling lost in darkness above me. The walls were covered in something that looked like frost but moved when I looked at it directly, shifting and flowing like liquid. In the center of the chamber was a vertical shaft, perfectly round, descending straight down into the earth. The whistling was coming from there, rising up in waves that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I approached the edge and looked down. My headlamp could not penetrate the darkness, but I could see shapes moving far below, pale and angular, crawling along the walls with movements that were too fast and too jerky to be natural. And then one of them looked up at me. I cannot describe what I saw. It was not a face. It was something that my brain tried to interpret as a face but failed. Too many eyes in the wrong places. A mouth that opened sideways. Skin that was not skin but something crystalline and sharp. It started climbing toward me, moving straight up the vertical shaft, defying gravity, and the whistling grew so loud that blood began to trickle from my ears. I ran faster than I have ever run in my life. My feet slipping on the ice, my lungs burning from the cold air. Behind me, I could hear them coming, dozens of them. Their limbs scraping against stone, their breathing wet and raw. The entrance seemed impossibly far away, the shaft stretching longer with every step, as if the mine itself was growing to trap me inside. I burst out into the daylight and collapsed in the snow. When I looked back at the entrance, there was nothing there. No sounds, no movement, Just the darkness of the shaft and that goddamn whistling, quieter now but still audible, still calling. I stumbled back to my cabin and locked every door and window. I tried to radio for help, but my equipment was not working. Nothing was working. My phone showed no signal. My camera had stopped taking pictures. Even my watch had frozen at exactly 3:47, the moment I had entered the mine. I told myself I would leave in the morning, that I would hike the 10 miles to the nearest road and flag down a car. But when I woke up, it was not morning. It was night again. I checked my watch, still 3:47. I checked my phone, dead. I looked outside, and the world had changed. The snow was wrong. It was not white anymore, but a pale blue, almost luminescent, glowing faintly in the darkness. The buildings of Kennecott were closer than they should have been, surrounding my cabin in a tight circle, their windows all facing me, all dark except for one. In the hospital, on the second floor, a light was on. And in that window, I could see a figure standing perfectly still, watching. I did not sleep that night. I sat in a corner with a knife in my hand, listening to the sounds outside. Footsteps in the snow, scratching at the walls, that whistling, constant and maddening, coming from everywhere and nowhere. At one point, something tried the door handle, turning it slowly, testing the lock. I heard breathing on the other side, deep and rhythmic, and then a voice that might have been human asked if I wanted to come back to the mine. Asked if I wanted to see what was at the bottom. Asked if I wanted to understand. I did not answer. I did not move. I just sat there, frozen, while whatever was outside waited. When I woke up again, I was lying in the snow half a mile from my cabin. 3 days had passed. I have no memory of how I got there or what happened during that time. My camera was gone. My gear was scattered across the hillside, and my hands were covered in frostbite, black and dead from the wrist down, but not random frostbite. The pattern was deliberate, symbols burned into my flesh by cold so intense that it had killed the tissue instantly. The same symbols I had seen on the corpse in the mine. A search and rescue team found me an hour later. They said I was lucky to be alive, that another hour in that cold would have killed me. They asked me what had happened, and I told them I had gotten lost, that I had fallen and hit my head. They did not believe me, but they did not push. They just evacuated me to Anchorage, where doctors spent 2 weeks trying to save my hands. They could not. I lost both of them below the wrist. But the worst part is not the amputation. The worst part is that I can still feel them. I can still feel something touching my hands, holding them, guiding them. And late at night, when the world is quiet and I am alone, I can hear it again. That whistling, that song, coming from somewhere deep inside me, in a place I cannot reach, in a place that should not exist. I looked into the history of Kennecott after I got out of the hospital. The mine was closed in 1938, but that is not the whole story. In the final year of operation, 11 miners disappeared. They went down for a routine shift and never came back up. Search parties went looking for them and found nothing. No bodies, no signs of collapse, just empty shafts and that whistling sound, which they blamed on unusual air currents. But I found something else in the archives. Letters from the mine foreman to the company headquarters. Letters that were never made public. He wrote about workers going missing, about men coming back from the deep shafts changed, speaking in languages nobody recognized, drawing symbols on the walls that hurt to look at. He wrote that something had been found at the bottom of the main shaft, something the engineers could not explain, a passage that went deeper than any mine should go, deeper than the earth itself. The company closed the mine and sealed the records. They paid the families of the missing men and left. And for 80 years, Kennecott sat empty, slowly being buried by snow and ice and time, until people started going back. Tourists, photographers, urban explorers, and some of them heard the whistling, and some of them went into the mines, and some of them never came back. I am one of the lucky ones. I got out, but I know I did not get out clean. Whatever is in that mine, whatever is at the bottom of that shaft, it touched me. It marked me, and sometimes, in my dreams, I am back there, standing at the edge of that vertical darkness, looking down at the things that crawl in the deep. And they are looking back at me, waiting patiently, because they know I will return. They always come back, the foreman wrote in his last letter. Once the mine calls to you, you always come back. I have not gone back. Not yet, but I feel the pull every day, growing stronger, an itch I cannot scratch, a song I cannot forget. My stumps ache with phantom pain that feels less like injury and more like hands reaching up from somewhere far below, trying to drag me down. So let me ask you something. If you heard that whistling, if you felt that pull, would you be strong enough to resist? Or would you do what I know, deep down, I am eventually going to do? Would you go back into the dark to find out what is waiting at the bottom? Leave your answer in the comments, because I need to know if I am the only one who feels this way. I need to know if anyone else has heard the song. Story 5. Eyes of the Yukon. I pulled a salmon from the Yukon River and found ice crystals growing where its eyes should have been. Perfect geometric formations that caught the light like diamonds and seemed to be watching me. That was 3 days ago. I haven't slept since. My hands wan to stop shaking, and the whispering from the river outside my cabin gets louder every night. My name is Robert Kane. I am a fish biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, stationed in Fort Yukon. Population 473. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the Yukon River is the lifeblood of the community, and where something went catastrophically wrong in the winter of 1983. I arrived in Fort Yukon 2 weeks ago to investigate reports of unusual fish deaths. Standard procedure, probably pollution or disease, but the moment I saw the first specimen, I knew this was different. The salmon lay on the examination table in the community center, its body intact, no signs of trauma or decay. But its eyes were gone. In their place, ice crystals had formed. Not random ice, structured crystals, hexagonal and precise, growing from inside the eye sockets like someone had planted seeds of winter in the fish's skull. The crystals were still cold, even though the fish had been out of the water for hours. Even though the room was heated to 70 degrees, I touched one with my bare finger and jerked back. It burned like dry ice, so cold it felt hot. The local elder who brought me the fish, a man named Joseph who fished the Yukon for 60 years, stood in the corner watching me examine it. He said this had happened before. February 1983. Thousands of fish washed up dead along a 40-mile stretch of river, all with ice crystals in their eye sockets. All whispering. I asked him what he meant by whispering. He didn't answer. Just told me to come back at night and listen for myself. I spent the day collecting samples. The department had sent me with a full kit for toxicology and pathology. I took tissue samples, water samples, sediment samples, everything by the book, but the ice crystals wouldn't melt. I put one in a sealed container and left it at room temperature. 3 hours later, it was still frozen solid. I tried warming it gently with a heat lamp. The crystal didn't melt. It grew, tiny branches extending from the main structure, reaching toward the warmth like the crystal was feeding on it. That night, I went down to the river. The temperature was 15 below zero. The Yukon was frozen solid, the ice thick enough to drive a truck across. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in shades of blue and silver. I stood on the bank where Joseph had found the fish and listened. At first, nothing, just the usual sounds of the Arctic night. Wind, the occasional crack of ice shifting. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft, barely audible, coming from beneath the ice. I dropped to my knees and pressed my ear against the frozen surface. The whisper resolved into words. No, not words, fragments of words, syllables repeated over and over in different pitches and rhythms. It sounded like hundreds of voices speaking at once, layered and overlapping, none of them quite human. I pulled back. The ice beneath my ear had fogged, and in that fog, I saw something. A shape, moving under the surface. Something large, flowing like water but solid like flesh. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the snow. The shape moved downstream and disappeared. The whispering faded. I stood there shaking, telling myself it was probably just a current under the ice. An air pocket, anything rational. But I knew what I'd seen. Something was alive down there. Something that shouldn't be. I went back to my cabin and tried to sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those ice crystals in the salmon's eye sockets. Perfectly formed, impossibly cold, growing toward warmth like they were searching for something. The next morning, more fish appeared on the riverbank. Dozens of them, all dead, all with ice crystals for eyes. Word spread through the village. People started talking about 1983, about the contamination that killed thousands of fish and then stopped as suddenly as it started. About the 3 fishermen who disappeared that winter. Their boats found drifting empty on the river with ice covering every surface. Joseph came to my cabin that afternoon. He brought coffee and a story. He'd been there in 1983, had seen the fish wash up, had heard the whispering grow so loud it kept the whole village awake. He He also seen what came out of the river on the last night before the fish stopped appearing. He described it as a mass. Not quite solid, not quite liquid. Transparent like ice but moving with intention. It flowed out of a hole in the river ice and onto the bank. Where it touched, everything froze instantly. Trees, rocks, the ground itself, and in the center of the mass, shapes moved. Human shapes, the three missing fishermen, suspended in ice, their eyes replaced with crystals. The mass retreated back into the river before dawn. The ice closed over it, and for 42 years, nothing happened. Until now. I asked Joseph what he thought it was. He used an Alaskan word I didn't know. When I asked him to translate, he said there wasn't a good English equivalent. The closest meaning was something like the hunger that lives in deep water. An old story. Something that existed in the river long before people came to Alaska. Something that sleeps in the depths and wakes when conditions are right. That night, I set up monitoring equipment along the riverbank. Motion sensors, thermal cameras, underwater microphones. If something was in the river, I'd record it. I'd have proof. I'd be able to explain this scientifically and stop the growing panic in the village. The equipment picked up something at 2 a.m. All the sensors triggered simultaneously. I pulled on my parka and ran to the river. What I found made my blood stop. The ice had cracked. A long fissure ran parallel to the shore, maybe 30 feet out. And from that crack, water was flowing up. Not out, up, against gravity. It rose in a column 3 feet high, moving and twisting like a snake made of liquid. The whispering was deafening now. I could hear it without pressing my ear to anything. Hundreds of voices, thousands maybe, all speaking in that fragmented language that hurt my brain to process. And in the moonlight, I could see shapes in the water column. Fish, dozens of them, swimming inside the vertical stream, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization. Their eyes were gone. Ice crystals glittered in the empty sockets. The water column moved toward me. Slowly, testing. I backed away, but my legs felt heavy, like I was moving through mud. The whispering grew louder, and I realized I could almost understand it now. The fragments were resolving into something coherent, something that sounded like my name. Robert, Robert, Robert. I ran, pure panic. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin and locked every door and window. I sat in the dark, listening to the river whisper my name over and over. The sound carried on the wind, filtered through the walls, filled my head until I thought I'd go insane. At dawn, the whispering stopped. I went outside. The crack in the ice was gone. The water column had vanished. But on my cabin door, written in frost, was a single word. Come. I spent the day researching. The library in Fort Yukon had old newspapers on microfiche. I found articles about 1983. The fish die-off, the missing fishermen. But I also found something else. A pattern. Every 42 years, going back to 1941, 1899, 1857. The same event. Dead fish with crystallized eyes. Disappearances. A brief period of terror. Then silence. Whatever was in the Yukon followed a cycle. And we were in the middle of it. I called my supervisor in Fairbanks. Told him everything. He listened patiently, then suggested I take some time off. The isolation was getting to me, he said. The darkness, the cold, classic symptoms of seasonal depression. He sent someone else to continue the investigation. I hung up and stared at the frost message on my door. It was still there, still visible even in the afternoon light. The letters were formed from ice crystals identical to the ones in the fish eyes. Perfect hexagonal structures that shouldn't exist in nature. That night, I didn't go to the river. I stayed inside with every light on, every heater running. But the whispering found me anyway. It came through the walls, through the floor, through the air itself. My name spoken in that chorus of inhuman voices, calling me to come to the water. At midnight, I looked out my window. The entire village was dark except for my cabin. Every house, every streetlight, everything off. And on the river, the ice was glowing. A soft blue light emanating from beneath the surface, pulsing like a heartbeat. Shapes moved on the ice. Human shapes, walking toward my cabin. I counted 5 of them. They moved stiffly, jerking, like puppets on strings. As they got closer, I saw their faces in the moonlight. Joseph, the 3 fishermen who disappeared in 1983, and someone else I didn't recognize, though from his clothes I guessed he was from an earlier cycle. Their eyes were gone. Ice crystals filled the sockets, glowing with that same blue light. They surrounded my cabin. standing silent, waiting. The whispering changed. No longer my name. Now it was showing me things. Images directly in my mind. The Yukon River as it was thousands of years ago. Clean, pure, full of life. Then humans came. First, the Athabascans, who respected the river, who understood what lived in its depths and gave it offerings. Then others, gold miners, developers, people who poured chemicals and waste into the water, people who took without giving back. The thing in the river was angry. It had been patient for centuries, tolerating the intrusions, but something had changed. The balance had broken. And now it was taking back what belonged to it, starting with eyes. The way humans had blinded themselves to the damage they caused, the thing in the river would blind them literally. Make them see through its eyes instead. The figures around my cabin raised their arms in unison, pointing at my door. The whispering reached a crescendo. The frost on every window formed the same word over and over. Come, 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 come. I understood then. I could resist and eventually be taken by force, becoming another puppet frozen in time. Or I could surrender willingly, walk to the river, let the thing replace my eyes with ice, join the others in their eternal vigil beneath the surface. Neither option was survival. I made a decision. I grabbed every chemical I had from my research kit. Formaldehyde, ethanol, acids. I mixed them in a bucket, creating a toxic soup that burned my nostrils. Then I ran outside, pushed through the circle of frozen watchers, and headed for the river. They followed. The whispering turned urgent, almost panicked. I reached the glowing ice and poured the chemicals through the crack. The blue light flared, then dimmed. The whispering turned to screaming. The figures collapsed on the ice, twitching. I poured everything I had into the river. The ice cracked wider. Something roared beneath the surface. Not sound, pressure. A wave of force that knocked me backward and made my ears bleed. Then silence. The blue light went out. The figures on the ice stopped moving. The whispering died. I lay on the frozen river, gasping, my vision blurred with blood. When dawn came, the villagers found me unconscious on the ice. They brought me back, warmed me, fed me. I was delirious for 2 days. When I recovered, Joseph told me the fish had stopped appearing. The whispers had stopped. Whatever I'd done had worked. For now, but he also said the cycle would continue. That poisoning the thing might buy them another 42 years. But it wouldn't, to kill it. Nothing could kill something that old, that fundamental to the river itself. It would heal, it would sleep, and in 2067, it would wake again. I left Fort Yukon a week later. The department accepted my resignation without questions. I moved to Arizona. Desert, no rivers, no ice, no fish. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear the whispering. Faint, distant, like it is calling to me across thousands of miles. And when I close my eyes, I see ice crystals forming in the darkness behind my eyelids, growing towards something I can name. The thing in the Yukon took something from me that night. Not my eyes, something deeper. Some part of my soul that recognized what it was, what it wanted, what it would eventually take from everyone. In 2067, I'll be 83 years old. If I am still alive, part of me hopes I won, TB. Part of me knows I have to be there, to warn them, to try to stop it again, to buy humanity another cycle. But mostly, I wonder if stopping it is the right thing to do. The thing in the river ISN, to evil. It is consequences. It's the bill come due for a century of abuse. And maybe, just maybe, it has every right to take what it is taking. Would you have fought it? Or would you have walked into the river and let it take you? Tell me in the comments below. Story 6. Warm gold. Have you ever held something in your hand that should be cold but burns like fever? Gold pulled from frozen ground that radiates heat like a living heart? I found nuggets like that in Hatcher Pass, Alaska, arranged in patterns that made my eyes water. And I'm going to tell you why 17 prospectors have vanished near that cursed mine since 1952. And why I am probably going to be the 18th. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 51 years old, a contractor from Colorado who spent his whole life building houses for other people. Last year, my wife left me. My business went under, and I decided I needed a fresh start. I had always heard stories about amateur prospectors striking it rich in Alaska, finding nuggets the size of walnuts just lying in creek beds. So I sold everything I owned, bought some basic mining equipment, and headed north in November of 2023. I know what you were thinking. November in Alaska is suicide for a beginner. You were right, but I was not thinking clearly. I was desperate. broken, and stupid enough to believe I could turn my life around by digging in frozen dirt. Hatcher Pass is about an hour north of Anchorage, a valley carved between mountains where gold was discovered in 1906. The Independence Mine operated there until World War II, pulling millions of dollars worth of ore from the ground. Now it sits abandoned, a state park in summer, a frozen wasteland in winter. Most of the claims are still active, owned by locals who work them in warmer months, but there are gaps. Forgotten corners where nobody bothers to look anymore. I found one of those corners on my third day. A small drainage about 2 miles from the main mine buildings, tucked behind a ridge where the snow drifted 10 feet deep. My metal detector started screaming before I even got close, a continuous shriek that should not have been possible unless I was standing on top of a car. I started digging, my hands already numb inside my gloves, my back aching from the cold. 6 inches down, I found the first nugget. It was the size of my thumb, rough and irregular, definitely natural gold. But when I picked it up, it was warm, not just unfrozen, warm, like it had been sitting in someone's pocket, heated by body temperature. I thought maybe it was a trick of my gloves, some kind of insulation effect, so I pulled them off and touched it with my bare skin. It was hot, almost too hot to hold. And as I stared at it, I realized it was not just a nugget. It had a shape, deliberate angles and curves, like someone had carved it, like it was trying to be something. I kept digging. I found 12 more nuggets in the next hour, all warm, all shaped. When I laid them out in the snow, they formed a pattern, a spiral, or maybe a constellation, or maybe something else entirely, something my brain could not quite process. They glowed faintly in the gray afternoon light, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I should have been ecstatic. I had just found thousands of dollars worth of gold on my third day. But all I felt was dread, a cold certainty that I had stumbled onto something I should have left buried. I pocketed the nuggets and hiked back to my truck, parked on an old mining road about a mile away. The sun was already setting, which meant it was maybe 3 in the afternoon. The darkness comes early that far north in winter, swallowing the world in stages, gray to black in the span of an hour. I drove back to the cabin I was renting in Willow, a tiny town south of the pass, and locked myself inside. That night, I could not sleep. The nuggets were in my backpack across the room, and I could hear them. A faint humming, like electrical interference, vibrating through the floorboards and into my bones. I got up and dumped them on the table, and they had rearranged themselves. I had put them in the bag randomly, loose and scattered, but now they were in order again. The same spiral pattern I had found them in, laid out perfectly on my kitchen table. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I had accidentally arranged them while packing, that the isolation and cold were getting to me, but I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I went to the local mining office and asked about the drainage where I had been digging. The clerk, an older woman with wind-burned skin and suspicious eyes, told me nobody worked that area anymore. Too many accidents, she said. Too many people going in and not coming out. I asked her what kind of accidents. She did not answer. She just looked at me with something like pity and told me to file a claim if I wanted. But she would advise against it. I filed anyway. I am not a superstitious man. I do not believe in curses or haunted ground. I believe in rock and metal and chemistry. I believe in things I can see and touch and sell. I went back to the drainage that afternoon, my detector in hand, my shovel strapped to my pack. The nuggets in my pocket pulsed with warmth, guiding me like a compass, pulling me toward something I could not name. I found the spot where I had been digging and started again. This time, I went deeper. 3 feet, 5 feet. The permafrost was like concrete, and my shovel rang with every strike, sending shocks up my arms that made my teeth ache. But I kept going, because the detector was still screaming, because the warmth in my pocket was growing hotter, because something down there wanted to be found. At 8 feet, my shovel hit something that was not rock. It was soft, yielding, like striking meat. I scraped away the ice and dirt and saw fabric. Old canvas, rotted and frozen, wrapped around something human-shaped. I had found a body. I should have stopped. I should have called the authorities. Let them deal with it. But I did not. I pulled the canvas away and saw the face beneath, frozen for decades but perfectly preserved. A man, maybe 60, with a gray beard and eyes wide open and an expression that was not quite fear and not quite ecstasy. His mouth was stretched in a grin, and his teeth were filled with gold. Not dental work, gold, Nuggets jammed between his teeth, down his throat, visible through his parted lips like he had died trying to swallow them. His hands were clenched around something. More nuggets, dozens of them, still warm, still glowing faintly in the darkness of the hole I had dug. And carved into the frozen ground around him was that pattern again. The spiral, the constellation, the shape that hurt to look at directly. I grabbed his hands and tried to pry them open, to take the gold he was holding. His fingers bent, and I heard a crack that might have been frozen joints or might have been something else. The nuggets spilled out into the dirt, and the moment they touched the ground, the temperature dropped. It dropped so fast that my breath crystallized instantly, falling like snow. It dropped so far that my exposed skin started to burn with cold, turning white and numb in seconds. And from somewhere deep beneath me, from a place farther down than my 8-foot hole, I heard a sound like grinding stone. Something was moving under the earth. Something large. Something that had been waiting. I climbed out of that hole faster than I thought possible, my hands slipping on ice, my boots scrabbling for purchase. The ground beneath me was shifting, bulging upward, cracking in spiderweb patterns that spread across the drainage. And from those cracks came warmth, a heat so intense that the snow melted instantly, turning to steam that rose in thick columns. I ran. I left my shovel, my detector, everything. I ran through the snow and the steam and the gathering darkness, my lungs burning, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. Behind me, I heard the earth opening, a tearing sound like fabric ripping, and a smell rose up that was wrong in ways I cannot describe. Copper and sulfur and something organic. Something rotten. I made it to my truck and drove away without looking back. But I could see it in my rearview mirror. The drainage was glowing now, a pale orange light rising from the ground like a false dawn. And shapes were moving in that light, tall and angular, made of shadow and heat. When I got back to my cabin, the nuggets were gone from my pockets. I searched everywhere, tore the cabin apart, but they had vanished. Except for one, a single nugget, sitting on my pillow, warm enough to scorch the fabric. And it had changed shape. Now it looked less like a nugget and more like a key. I tried to leave Alaska the next day. I packed my truck, settled my bills, and started driving south. But every time I got more than 50 miles from Hatcher Pass, the pain started. A burning in my chest that felt like my heart was cooking from the inside. I would have to turn around, drive back, and the pain would fade. I tried 3 times. Each time, the pain got worse. Each time, I came closer to passing out at the wheel. I am trapped here now, tied to this place by something I do not understand. Something that wants me to go back to that drainage, to finish what I started. The nugget on my pillow has been joined by others. Every morning, there are more of them, arranged in new patterns on my floor, my table, my bed. And they are getting hotter. I looked into the history of the area. Since 1952, 17 people have vanished near that drainage. All of them were prospectors. All of them filed claims for that exact location. Their bodies were never found, but sometimes their equipment turned up, melted and fused together like it had been exposed to incredible heat. I also found something else. Journal entries from miners in the early 1900s, talking about gold that burned to the touch, about dreams of something sleeping under the mountains, about patterns carved into stone that predated human habitation. They called it the warm gold, and they said it was not gold at all but something else, something that only looked like gold because that is what we wanted to see. One miner wrote that the nuggets were not treasure. They were bait, or maybe they were pieces of something larger, something that had been broken apart and scattered, waiting to be gathered back together, waiting for someone stupid enough to bring them home. I have all of them now. Hundreds of nuggets, appearing in my cabin every night, forming patterns that grow more complex with each passing day. They cover my floor in spirals and grids and shapes that hurt my eyes when I try to understand them. And they are calling to me, a constant hum that fills my head with images I cannot escape. I see the thing under the mountain. I see it as it was millions of years ago, when the earth was young and molten. I see it burrowing through stone and fire, feeding on heat and pressure, growing larger with each passing age. And I see what it wants. It wants to be whole again. It wants its pieces back. All of them, including the ones that are inside me now, working their way through my bloodstream, changing me cell by cell into something that can survive what is coming. Tonight, I am going back to the drainage. I do not have a choice anymore. The pain is constant now. a fire in my bones that only fades when I move toward the mountains. I am bringing all the nuggets with me, every single piece, and I am going to put them back where they belong. And maybe, if I do that, it will let me go. Or maybe it will take me instead, pull me down into the heat and darkness where the other 17 prospectors are waiting, our bodies fuel for something vast and patient and endlessly hungry. So tell me this, if you found gold that burned like a star, would you take it? Would you risk everything for a chance to be rich? Or would you leave it buried and walk away? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know. I need to know if anyone else would have been strong enough to resist what I could not. Story 7. Shadow Touch. What would you do if you woke up to find handprints burned into your skin by cold so intense it left scars like acid? Handprints with 6 fingers. That happened to me during the Anchorage blackout of 1979. And I'm going to tell you about the things that walked through our streets that night, the things that touched us in the darkness, and why the official explanation is a lie designed to keep people from understanding what really happened. My name is Tom Brennan. I was 37 years old in January of 1979, working as a night manager at a grocery store in downtown Anchorage. I had a wife, 2 kids, a mortgage on a small house in the Muldoon neighborhood. I was as ordinary as they come, living an ordinary life in an ordinary city. Until the night the power went out and the shadows came alive. It started at 11:43 on January 19th. I remember the exact time because I was looking at the clock when every light in the store went dark. Not flickering, not dimming, just instant, complete darkness that swallowed everything. The hum of the refrigerators died, the background noise of the city vanished. Even the emergency lights failed to kick on, which should not have been possible since they ran on separate batteries. I stood there in the blackness, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but they never did. The darkness was absolute, thicker than it should have been, like something physical pressing against my face. I called out to my 2 employees, but my voice sounded muffled and distant, absorbed by the dark. Nobody answered. I fumbled for my flashlight, kept under the counter for exactly this kind of situation. My hands found it, clicked it on, and the beam died after maybe 3 feet, swallowed by shadows that seemed too solid to be natural. I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. That is when I heard the first scream. It came from outside, high-pitched and terrified, cutting through the silence like a knife. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire city was screaming. Thousands of voices rising in panic and pain, echoing off the buildings in waves that made my skin crawl. I moved toward the front windows, my flashlight barely showing me the way. Through the glass, I could see shapes moving in the street. Dark shapes, darker than the night around them, flowing like liquid smoke between the cars and streetlights. And they were touching people. I watched a woman running down the sidewalk, her arms pumping, her mouth open in a silent scream. One of the shadows flowed across the ground and rose up in front of her, impossibly tall and impossibly thin. It reached out with something that might have been an arm, and the moment it made contact with her shoulder, she collapsed. She hit the pavement hard, convulsing, and even from inside the store I could see the frost spreading across her skin from where it had touched her. More shapes appeared, dozens of them, hundreds, pouring out of alleys and doorways and from beneath parked cars. They moved with purpose, hunting, searching for people in the darkness. And wherever they touched, they left marks. Burns that were not burns. Frostbite that formed in seconds, spreading across skin in patterns that looked almost deliberate. I backed away from the window and ran for the storage room, where I knew there was a battery-powered radio. My employees were already there, huddled in the corner, their faces pale and terrified in the weak glow of a lighter. I grabbed the radio and turned it on, but all I got was static and fragments of panicked voices. Emergency services were overwhelmed. The entire city was dark. Nobody knew what was happening. One of my employees, a kid named Danny who was maybe 19, grabbed my arm and pointed at the wall. The temperature was dropping. I could see my breath now, thick clouds of vapor that hung in the air. And the walls were covered in frost, growing before our eyes, spreading in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The storage room door started to rattle, not like someone was trying to get in, but like something was testing it, feeling it, learning what it was. The metal handle was turning white with ice, and I could hear a sound on the other side that was not quite breathing and not quite wind. A wet, rasping noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We piled boxes against the door and retreated to the far corner. The lighter was running out of fuel, the flame getting smaller and weaker, and in the growing darkness I could see them. Shapes moving in the shadows at the edge of our vision, watching us with something that might have been eyes. They did not have faces, not really, just suggestions of faces, voids where features should have been. But they had hands, long, reaching hands with too many fingers, each one ending in a point that looked sharp as glass. The door burst open, not violently, not with force, but like it simply stopped existing. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, and the shadows poured in like water. I felt them pass through me, a cold so intense that my muscles locked up and my thoughts scattered. It was not just physical cold, it was the absence of everything. Heat, light, hope, all of it drained away in an instant. One of them touched Danny. Its hand settled on his face, covering his eyes and mouth, and he went rigid. The frost spread across his skin in spirals, turning his face white and then blue and then black. His eyes rolled back, and he started to shake, his body seizing as the cold worked its way through him. When the shadow pulled away, he collapsed, unconscious, his face covered in frostbite marks that formed a pattern. A handprint with 6 fingers. I do not remember much after that. I know I ran. I know I made it out of the store and into the street, where the chaos was complete. People were running in every direction, crashing into cars and each other, trying to escape the shadows that flowed through the darkness like hunting dogs. The cold was everywhere now, so intense that the snow on the ground was turning to ice, spreading in sheets that crackled under my feet. I saw things that night that I still cannot explain. I saw a shadow reach into a man's chest and pull out something that glowed faintly, like a dying ember, and the man dropped dead instantly. I saw shadows gathering around a woman who had fallen, touching her over and over, covering her body in frost until she looked like a statue made of ice. I saw one of them stand in front of a running car, and the engine died, the metal popping and cracking as ice formed inside the machinery. I ran for 2 miles through that frozen hell, my lungs burning, my face numb, until I reached my house. My family was inside, barricaded in the master bedroom, and when I pounded on the door, my wife almost did not let me in. She said I looked wrong, that my eyes were not right, that something had followed me home. But she opened the door anyway, and I collapsed on the floor, shaking so hard my teeth rattled. We stayed in that room for 7 hours. 7 hours of darkness and cold and the sound of things moving through our house, opening doors, searching rooms, their wet breathing audible through the walls. My son, who was 6 years old, kept saying he could see faces in the shadows. Dozens of them, watching us from the corners where the candlelight could not reach. When the power finally came back at 6:37 in the morning, the shadows vanished. Not gradually, not fading away, but gone in an instant, like they had never existed. The temperature rose, the frost melted, and the city woke up to find itself changed. 347 people were hospitalized that night with severe frostbite. 83 died from exposure, even though most of them had been indoors when it happened. Every single one of them had the same marks on their bodies. Handprints with too many fingers, patterns that looked like writing in a language nobody could read. The official explanation was a power grid failure combined with an unusual weather phenomenon. A temperature inversion, they called it, that caused pockets of extreme cold to form at ground level. They said the panic and darkness caused mass hysteria, that people hurt themselves running and falling in the chaos. They said the marks were just frostbite, nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. But I know what I saw. I know it touched me in that darkness. And I know it left something behind. I noticed the changes about a week later. My hands were always cold now, cold enough that my wife flinched when I touched her. My breath came out as visible vapor even in heated rooms. And when I looked in mirrors, my reflection sometimes moved a fraction of a second too late, like it was mimicking me instead of being me. Other survivors reported similar things. A man in my neighborhood said he could see in complete darkness now, that shadows were no longer dark to him but filled with light and movement. A woman 3 blocks away claimed she could hear voices in the static between radio stations, voices speaking in that same language the patterns suggested. A teenager who had been touched on the face said his frostbite scars glowed faintly at night, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The city tried to ignore it. They demolished buildings where people had died. They pressured doctors to falsify records. They paid off families to stay quiet. But you cannot cover up something that big, something that touched hundreds of people and left them changed. I started researching. I found old newspaper articles from the territorial days, stories about winter nights when the darkness came alive, when shadows walked through native villages and took people away. The stories all describe the same thing. Figures made of cold and darkness, hunting in the blackest nights, leaving marks on those they touched. The native peoples had names for them in languages that were almost lost. The closest translation I could find meant something like the hungry shadows or the cold that takes. They had always been here, these things, living in the spaces between light and dark, in the cold and the deep winter. And they had always taken people, one or two at a time, in remote places where nobody would notice. But in 1979, something changed. The blackout gave them an opening, a moment when the entire city was vulnerable, and they came in force. I think they were testing us. I think they were seeing how many they could take, how much they could change, before we fought back. And when the lights came on and they retreated, I think they learned everything they needed to know. Because it is happening again. Small blackouts, isolated incidents, always in winter, always at night. In Fairbanks last year, a neighborhood lost power for 20 minutes and 4 people wound up in the hospital with frostbite. In Nome 2 months ago, the whole town went dark for an hour and 12 people disappeared. And just last week, here in Anchorage, a single apartment building lost power, and when it came back on, everyone inside was unconscious, their bodies covered in those same 6-fingered handprints. The shadows are getting bolder. They are learning to survive longer in the light, to move faster, to take more. And every person they touch becomes a little bit like them. A little colder, a little darker, a little less human. I can feel it in myself now. The cold has spread from my hands to my arms, to my chest, working its way toward my heart. My wife left me 3 years ago, taking the kids with her. She said I scared her, that I did not feel like her husband anymore. She was right. I am not the same person I was before that night. Sometimes, in the darkness of my apartment, I can see them. The shadows, they stand in my corners, watching me, waiting. And I understand now that they are not monsters. They are what we become, what I am becoming. The cold that takes does not kill us. It transforms us. It makes us part of the darkness, part of the hunger that waits in the spaces between stars and seasons. I do not have much time left. Soon the transformation will be complete, and I will become one of them, hunting in the blackouts, touching people and spreading the cold. But before that happens, I need you to understand something. They are not supernatural. They are not demons or ghosts. They are a form of life that evolved in places where heat and light are absent, where cold is the only constant. And they are spreading. Every blackout is an opportunity. Every winter night without power is an invitation. And with climate change pushing the jet stream and causing more extreme weather, with power grids aging and failing more frequently, those opportunities are multiplying. So let me ask you this. When your power goes out on a dark winter night, will you stay in the light, huddled around candles and flashlights, praying for dawn? Or will you venture into the darkness to check on neighbors, to help others, to be a hero? Because that is what they are counting on. They are counting on our decency, our humanity, our unwillingness to hide while others suffer. They are counting on us to come to them. Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me what you would do, because I need to know if anyone out there is strong enough to resist the urge to help, smart enough to stay in the light, and selfish enough to survive what is coming. Story 8. Headlights with teeth. What would you do if you looked in your rearview mirror and saw headlights that blinked like eyes, that moved closer even though you were going 80 miles an hour, that left frost patterns on your windshield shaped like bite marks? I am a long-haul trucker, and I drove the Dalton Highway in Alaska during the winter of 1985. I heard the last transmission from Ray Kowalski before he disappeared, and I know what really happened to him, because the same thing is hunting me right now. My name is Carl Jensen. I am 59 years old, been driving trucks for 37 years, and I have seen every highway, back road, and forgotten strip of asphalt this country has to offer. But nothing prepared me for the Dalton. 414 miles of ice and darkness cutting through the Arctic, from Fairbanks to Deadhorse, servicing the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay. In winter, the sun barely rises, the temperature hits 60 below, and you are alone for hours at a time with nothing but your CB radio and the knowledge that if your truck breaks down, you have maybe 30 minutes before you freeze to death. I was hauling equipment north on February 7th, 1985. It was my third run up the Dalton that winter, and I knew the road well enough to be comfortable but not well enough to be careless. The weather was clear, which on the Dalton means you can see maybe a quarter mile through the blowing snow. My rig was running smooth, my heater was cranked, and I had a thermos of coffee that was still hot. That is when I heard Ray on the CB. His voice came through around 11 at night, crackling with static and interference. He was heading south, about 40 miles ahead of me, and he sounded confused. He said something was following him. Not another truck, not a vehicle he recognized. Just headlights that stayed exactly 300 yards behind him no matter how fast he went or how slow. He said they were too bright, that they hurt to look at in his mirrors, and that they blinked. Not like a turn signal, like they were opening and closing. I told him it was probably just another trucker playing games, riding his tail for kicks. It happens sometimes on lonely roads, bored drivers looking for entertainment. But Ray said no, this was different. He had tried slowing down to let it pass, and it slowed down too. He had tried speeding up, pushing his rig to 70 on icy roads, and the lights matched his speed perfectly. And when he looked close in his mirrors, he could see something wrong with them. The beams were not circles like normal headlights. They were vertical slits, like the pupils of a cat. Then his transmission changed. His voice went higher, panicked. He said the lights were getting closer, that his cab was getting cold even though his heater was running full blast. He said he could see frost forming on his windows, spreading in patterns that looked like something had pressed against the glass from outside. And he said the headlights had opened wider, and inside them he could see something dark and wet, something that reflected his taillights like rows of enamel. He screamed. Not words, just a raw sound of terror that cut through the static. Then his radio went dead. I tried to raise him for the next 20 minutes, calling his handle over and over, but got nothing. I contacted the dispatcher in Fairbanks and told them what I had heard. They said they would send someone to check on him, but it would take hours. The nearest help was 100 miles away, and in weather like this, response times were measured in half days, not minutes. I kept driving north, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, my eyes constantly checking my mirrors. The road stretched out behind me, empty and dark, illuminated only by the red glow of my taillights. Nothing followed me. Nothing moved in the endless expanse of snow and ice. But I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found Ray's truck about an hour later. It was pulled off to the side of the road, the engine still running, headlights cutting through the snow. I parked behind it and grabbed my flashlight, even though every instinct screamed at me to keep driving. But you do not leave another trucker stranded on the Dalton. It is an unwritten rule. You stop, you check, you help. The moment I opened my door, the cold hit me like a physical blow. Not normal Arctic cold, something worse, something that went through my coat and thermal layers and straight into my bones. My flashlight beam looked weak and sickly in the darkness, barely penetrating the swirling snow. Ray's cab was frozen solid. The door handle was covered in ice so thick I had to chip it away with the back of my flashlight. When I finally got it open, the interior was like a freezer. Everything was coated in frost. The steering wheel, the dashboard, the seat, and the temperature gauge inside the cab read -100 degrees Fahrenheit. That should not have been possible. Even if the heater had failed completely, the cab should not have frozen that fast or that cold. Ray was gone. His seatbelt was still buckled, hanging in the air like he had vanished while wearing it. His coffee cup was frozen to the cup holder. The liquid inside expanded into a column of brown ice. And on the windshield, pressed into the frost from the outside, were marks. Not handprints, mouth prints, dozens of them, overlapping, covering the entire surface of the glass. Each one showed the clear impression of teeth. Too many teeth, arranged in concentric circles like the mouth of a lamprey. I backed out of that cab so fast I slipped on the ice and landed hard on my tailbone. My flashlight rolled away, and in the moment before I scrambled to retrieve it, I saw something in the darkness beyond Ray's truck. Two lights, vertical slits, glowing with a pale yellow luminescence that was not quite right, that seemed to generate its own fog in the air around them. They blinked, slowly, deliberately, and when they opened again, they were closer. I ran back to my truck, threw myself into the cab, and slammed the locks. My hands shook so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the transmission into gear, my tires spinning on ice before finally catching. I did not look back. I did not check my mirrors. I just drove, pushing my rig as fast as I dared on that frozen death trap of a road. But the lights followed. They appeared in my mirrors about 5 minutes later, exactly 300 yards back, matching my speed perfectly. And my cab started to get cold. Not the heater failing, just cold seeping in through the doors and windows and vents, like the outside was reaching inside to claim me. Frost began forming on my windshield from the inside, spreading in those same circular patterns, those same teeth marks. I grabbed my CB and screamed for help, broadcasting on every channel, begging anyone within range to respond. Static answered me, thick and wet, and underneath it I could hear something that might have been breathing. Heavy, rhythmic, hungry. The lights got closer, 200 yards, 100. I could see them clearly now in my mirrors, and they were not headlights. They were eyes, massive eyes that glowed from within, with pupils that contracted and dilated as they focused on me. And below them, barely visible in the swirling snow, was a mouth. A vast, circular mouth filled with rings of teeth that rotated independently, grinding against each other, creating a sound like ice breaking under pressure. It was not a vehicle. It was not a machine. It was something alive, something that moved on legs I could not quite see, something that wore the appearance of headlights the way an anglerfish wears a lure. My speedometer hit 90. My rig was shaking, threatening to lose control, but I did not dare slow down. The cold was intensifying, so severe now that my breath came out as clouds of ice crystals that clattered against the dashboard. My fingers were going numb. My face felt like frozen meat, and the thing behind me was getting closer, its eyes growing larger in my mirrors, its mouth opening wider. Then I saw lights ahead. Real lights, a convoy of 3 trucks heading south, their high beams cutting through the storm. I flashed my lights, honked my horn, anything to get their attention. They slowed down as they passed me, and in that moment, the thing behind me vanished. Just gone. No lights in my mirrors. No frost on my windows. The cold faded instantly, replaced by the normal, manageable chill of an Arctic night. I pulled over and sat there shaking for 20 minutes before I could trust my legs to work. The southbound convoy had stopped, and one of the drivers walked back to check on me. He said I looked like I had seen a ghost. I told him about Ray, about the frozen cab, about the thing that had chased me. He listened quietly, then told me I was not the first. Over the past 3 years, 7 truckers had disappeared on the Dalton Highway in winter. Their rigs were found abandoned, engines running, cabs frozen at impossible temperatures. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just empty seats and frost patterns on the windows that nobody wanted to examine too closely. The official explanation was always the same: driver error, exposure, the hazards of winter trucking in the Arctic. But the other drivers knew. They had all seen the lights at some point. Always in winter, always at night, always when they were alone. Some of them had been chased. Some of them had lost time, coming back to awareness hours later with no memory of what had happened and frostbite on their hands in patterns that looked like something had gripped them. And some of them, like Ray, had simply vanished. The driver told me to stay with the convoy, to never drive the Dalton alone in winter again. I agreed. I drove with them all the way to Fairbanks, my rig sandwiched safely between theirs, and I swore I would never go back. But here's the thing about the Dalton. The oil fields need supplies year-round. The money is too good to pass up. And eventually, you convince yourself it was just fear, just imagination, just the isolation playing tricks on your mind. You convince yourself it could not have been real. I went back. 3 weeks later, I took another run north. This time I drove during the day, and nothing happened. I did it again a month later, then again. Each time was fine, each time was normal, and slowly, I started to believe I had imagined it all. Then last month, I took a night run. I needed the money, and the dispatcher promised it would be quick. Up and back in 36 hours. Easy work for a veteran. I saw the lights around midnight. 300 yards back, vertical slits, blinking slowly, and my cab started to get cold. I have been driving for 6 hours straight now, pushing my rig past the safety limits, burning through fuel faster than I should. The lights are still there, always exactly 300 yards back, and the frost is spreading across my windshield despite the defroster running full blast. My hands are black with frostbite, and I can barely feel the steering wheel anymore. But I keep driving, because the moment I stop, the moment I slow down, it will catch me. I am recording this on my phone because I need someone to know what happened. I need someone to understand that Ray did not die from exposure or driver error. He was taken, eaten, consumed by something that lives in the Arctic darkness, something that hunts vehicles because we glow and move and provide an easy lure for the warmth inside. I can see the lights of Dead Horse ahead, maybe 10 miles out. If I can make it to the station, if I can reach other people, maybe it will leave me alone. Maybe I will survive, but my engine is starting to sputter, and the cold has reached my chest now, spreading through my body like ice forming in my veins. If you ever drive through Alaska in winter, if you ever take the Dalton Highway when the sun is down, and you see headlights in your mirror that move wrong, that blink like eyes, that make your cab cold despite the heater running, do not stop. Do not slow down, and do not look too close. Because once you see what is really behind those lights, once you understand what is watching you, it knows that you know. And it will never stop following. So tell me, would you take the job? Would you drive the Dalton in winter for double pay, knowing something might be waiting in the darkness? Would you risk it for the money? Or would you stay home and sleep safe? Write your answer in the comments, because I want to know who else out there is foolish enough or desperate enough to make the same mistake I did. Story 9. Singing ice. Have you ever heard ice sing? Not the crack and groan of glaciers calving, but actual singing. Harmonies so beautiful they make you forget where you are, what you are doing, how cold the water is beneath your kayak. I heard that song in LeConte Bay, Alaska, 3 months ago. And when I looked down into the black water to find the source, I saw faces. Dozens of them, pale and bloated and staring up at me with eyes that should have been dead. Their mouths were open, moving in perfect synchronization, and the song was coming from them. My name is Michael Reeves. I am 48 years old, a high school teacher from Seattle, and I have been sea kayaking for 20 years. Last summer, I decided to take a solo trip to southeast Alaska to paddle among the icebergs of LeConte Bay and photograph the glacier. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime, a chance to disconnect, to challenge myself, to see something few people ever experience. Instead, I found something that has destroyed my sleep, my peace of mind, and my ability to look at water without feeling sick. I launched from Petersburg on July 15th, during the height of summer when the days stretch endlessly and the ice is at its most spectacular. The forecast was perfect. Calm seas, clear skies. I had a week of supplies, a satellite phone for emergencies, and enough experience to handle the cold water and unpredictable conditions. I felt confident, prepared, in control. The first 2 days were everything I had hoped for. The bay was stunning, filled with icebergs of every size and shape, glowing blue in the sunlight. Seals lounged on the ice. Eagles circled overhead. The glacier itself rose like a frozen cathedral at the head of the bay, calving chunks of ice into the water with sounds like thunder. I paddled through it all in a state of awe, taking hundreds of photos, camping on small islands, completely alone in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. The singing started on the third night. I was camped on a rocky beach about 2 miles from the glacier, my tent pitched above the tide line, my kayak pulled up and secured. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon around midnight, and I was sitting by my small fire, drinking coffee and listening to the silence. That is when I heard it, faint at first, barely audible over the lap of water against the shore. A single voice, high and clear, singing a melody I did not recognize. Then another voice joined it, harmonizing perfectly. Then another. Within minutes, the entire bay was filled with song. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The voices rose and fell in waves, weaving together in complex patterns that seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the water, from the ice, from the air itself. The melody was haunting and ancient, like something that had been sung for thousands of years, passed down through generations that had no names and no history. I stood at the edge of the water, transfixed, trying to locate the source. But there was nothing, no boats, no people, just the dark water and the glowing icebergs and that impossible, ethereal choir filling the night. The song lasted maybe 15 minutes before fading away, the voices dropping out one by one until only silence remained. I went to bed confused but not frightened. I assumed it was some acoustic phenomenon. Sound waves bouncing off the ice in strange ways, maybe whale songs distorted by the geology of the bay. I had heard of singing ice before, the way glaciers and icebergs make noises as they crack and shift. This was probably just a variation of that, but the next morning, I found footprints in the sand around my tent. Small footprints, barefoot, leading from the water to within inches of my tent flap and then back again. Dozens of them, overlapping, circling my campsite like whatever had made them had been pacing, watching me sleep. And they were wet, still glistening in the morning light, even though the tide had not come up that high during the night. I packed up quickly and got back on the water, telling myself it was probably just a curious seal, that I was overreacting, that the isolation was making me paranoid. But as I paddled deeper into the bay, closer to the glacier, I started noticing things I had missed before. Shapes in the water that vanished when I looked directly at them. Shadows that moved beneath my kayak, keeping pace with me, too large and too human-shaped to be fish. And every iceberg I passed seemed to have marks on it. Scratches, handprints, faces carved into the ice. Their features eroded and distorted but still recognizable as human. The singing started again that afternoon. Full daylight this time, the sun high overhead, and the voices came from all around me. I stopped paddling and let my kayak drift, listening, trying to understand what I was hearing. The melody was the same as the night before, but now I could make out something underneath it. Words, not in English, not in any language I recognized, but definitely words, repeated over and over in that haunting, multi-layered harmony. I looked down into the water, and that is when I saw the first face. It was maybe 10 feet below the surface, pale and swollen, floating in the dark water with its eyes open and its mouth moving. At first, I thought it was a corpse, a drowning victim, and my immediate instinct was to call for help. But then I saw another face, and another, dozens of them, suspended in the water beneath me, all staring up at my kayak with expressions that were not quite dead and not quite alive. Their lips moved in perfect synchronization, forming the words of the song, and as I watched in frozen horror, they began to rise. They came up slowly, their bodies emerging from the depths, and I could see them clearly now. Men, women, children, all of them naked, their skin bleached white by the cold water, their hair drifting around their heads like kelp. They moved without swimming, just ascending in a vertical line, their arms at their sides, their mouths never stopping that terrible song. I paddled harder than I have ever paddled in my life, my heart slamming against my ribs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But they followed. They did not swim after me. They glided through the water with impossible speed, staying just beneath my kayak, their faces tilting to keep me in view, their singing growing louder. I looked ahead and saw that I was surrounded by icebergs, massive chunks of glacier ice that had drifted together, forming a maze I would have to navigate carefully to avoid capsizing. And that is when I realized the truth. The singing was not coming from the bodies in the water. It was coming from inside the ice. I could see them now, trapped within the bergs, frozen in place with their mouths open, their eyes staring out through the blue-white walls of their prisons. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all singing that same ancient song. I was paddling through a graveyard, a massive, floating cemetery of people who had been entombed in the glacier, some of them for years, maybe decades, maybe longer. And something about the warmth of summer, about the ice melting and calving into the bay, had released them. Not fully, not enough to let them escape, just enough to let them sing. My kayak bumped against an iceberg, and I felt something grab my paddle. I looked down and saw hands reaching up from the water, pale fingers wrapping around the shaft, trying to pull it down. I yanked it free and used it to push away from the ice, but more hands appeared, dozens of them, gripping the sides of my kayak, pulling themselves up, trying to climb in. Their faces broke the surface, water streaming from their mouths and noses, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that was desperate and hungry. They were not attacking me. They were trying to use me, trying to pull themselves up and out of the water, to use my kayak as a platform, to escape the depths that held them. But there were too many. The weight of their bodies was pulling my kayak down, tipping it, filling it with water. I had maybe seconds before it capsized and I went into the water with them. Into water that was 38 degrees, cold enough to kill me in minutes even with my dry suit. Into water filled with hands and faces and bodies that wanted out. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my flare gun from the emergency kit and fired it straight up. The red flare arced into the sky, trailing smoke, and the moment it ignited, the hands released me. All at once, the bodies sank back into the water, disappearing into the depths, and the singing stopped. Just silence, complete and absolute. I paddled out of that maze of ice as fast as my burning arms could manage, not stopping until I was back in open water, far from the glacier, far from whatever haunted those depths. My satellite phone was soaking wet from the water that had gotten into my kayak, but I managed to get a signal and call for a rescue. A fishing boat picked me up 6 hours later, and I abandoned my kayak, my gear, everything. I just wanted off that water. The crew asked me what had happened, why I had fired the flare. I told them I had capsized, that I needed help. I did not mention the singing. I did not mention the faces. I knew how it would sound. I knew they would think I was suffering from hypothermia or dehydration or mental breakdown. And maybe I was, maybe I am, but when I got back to Petersburg, I started researching. I found records of missing people in Southeast Alaska going back over 100 years. Kayakers, fishermen, native hunters, all of them vanished in or near LeConte Bay. Their bodies never recovered. The official explanation was always drowning. The cold water and unpredictable ice making recovery impossible. But I also found stories, old stories, passed down through the Tlingit people who have lived in this area for thousands of years. Stories about the glacier that sings, about the spirits trapped in the ice, about travelers who went into the bay and came back changed, unable to stop hearing the melody, unable to forget the faces they had seen. The Tlingit have a name for them, the drowned singers. They say the glacier is not just ice but a living entity, that it takes people who venture too close and adds them to its choir. That the singing is a lure, drawing others in, adding more voices to the harmony. And that once you hear the song, once you see the faces, you become connected to them. Marked, called. I hear it every night now. The singing, faint but unmistakable, coming from nowhere and everywhere. I hear it in the shower, in the rain, in the sound of water running from the tap, and when I look in mirrors, when I catch my reflection in windows, I can see something behind me. Pale shapes in the background, their mouths open, their hands reaching. I have moved 3 times in 3 months, each time farther from water, farther from the coast. But it does not matter. The singing follows me, and I know, deep down, that it is calling me back. That the glacier wants me to return, to finish what I started, to join the choir that sings in the ice. Last week, I found myself standing in my kitchen with my car keys in my hand and no memory of how they got there. My GPS was set to Petersburg. My bags were packed. I had been planning to go back, to return to LeConte Bay. And I did not remember making that decision. Something else had made it for me. Something that speaks through the singing, that reaches into my mind and pulls me toward the water. I deleted the destination. I threw away the keys. But I know it is only a matter of time. The pull is getting stronger every day, and my will to resist is getting weaker. I find myself humming the melody now, unconsciously, adding my voice to the song that never stops playing in my head. And when I sleep, I dream I am underwater, sinking into the black depths, while pale hands reach up to welcome me and voices tell me I am home. I am writing this as a warning. If you ever kayak in Southeast Alaska, if you ever paddle among the icebergs of LeConte Bay, and you hear singing, beautiful and haunting and impossible, do not stop to listen. Do not look into the water. Do not try to find the source. Paddle away as fast as you can, and do not look back, because once you hear that song, once you see those faces, you belong to them. You become part of the glacier, part of the choir, forever. So tell me this, if you heard the most beautiful sound in the world, would you investigate? Would you follow it, even knowing it might be dangerous? Or would you have the strength to turn away? Leave your answer in the comments, because I need to know if anyone out there is stronger than I am. I need to know if anyone can resist what I cannot. Story 10. Voice that knew when. The radio told me I would die at 3:47 a.m. on February 19th, crushed beneath ice that would fall from a clear sky, and I had 17 hours to prove it wrong. My name is Tom Richter. In February 1978, I was the night manager at the Northern Lights Motel in Nome, Alaska. 28 years old, single, living paycheck to paycheck in a town where winter lasts 8 months and the sun barely climbs above the horizon. I took the night shift because it paid better and because I didn't mind the solitude. The broadcast started at 6 p.m. on February 18th. I was in the motel office, half watching a small television and half listening to NOM, our local AM station. The DJ had been playing classic rock, talking about the cold snap we were experiencing. 40 below, the kind of cold that makes metal snap and car engines refuse to start. Then the music stopped, mid-song, just cut off, replaced by static. I figured it was the cold affecting the equipment. That happened sometimes. I got up to adjust the dial, but before I touched it, the static changed, organized itself, resolved into something that almost sounded like breathing. Deep, rhythmic. Then a voice came through. Male, calm, utterly emotionless. Like a computer trying to sound human but getting it slightly wrong. The voice said, Margaret Sullivan, Front Street, February 19th, 9:15 a.m. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Furnace malfunction. Death will be painless. She will not wake. Then back to static. I stood frozen, my hand hovering over the radio dial. What the hell had I just heard? Some kind of sick prank. But who would joke about something like that? Margaret Sullivan was real. She lived in a small house on Front Street. 76 years old. Everyone in Nome knew her. The static continued for maybe 30 seconds. Then the voice returned. David Chen, 2nd Avenue, February 19th, 2:33 p.m. Vehicular accident. Black ice. Impact with utility pole. Broken neck. Instantaneous. My stomach dropped. David Chen ran the hardware store. Married. 3 kids. The voice was listing specific people. Specific times. Specific causes of death. All dated tomorrow. February 19th. I grabbed the phone and called the radio station. Busy signal. I tried again. Still busy. The voice on the radio continued its litany. Name after name. Address after address. Time of death. Manner of death. Clinical. Precise. Horrifying. By 7 p.m., the voice had listed 32 people. All Nome residents. All scheduled to die the next day. My hands were shaking as I wrote down the names I recognized. Friends. Neighbors. People I saw at the grocery store. The voice described their deaths with the same flat affect it might use to read a weather report. Then, at 7:41 p.m., it said my name. Thomas Richter. Northern Lights Motel. February 19th, 3:47 a.m. Blunt force trauma. Icefall. Skull fracture. Death within minutes. Icefall? The sky was clear. The forecast showed no precipitation for days. How would ice fall on me? The voice provided no additional details. Just those cold, specific facts. My name, my location, my death. 6 hours from now, I called the police, told them about the broadcast. The dispatcher, a woman named Linda, said she was aware. They'd been receiving calls for the past hour. The station manager at Nome had reported that someone had hijacked their signal. They couldn't shut it down or override it. The broadcast was coming from somewhere else, piggybacking on their frequency. Linda told me not to worry. Probably some hacker with a sick sense of humor. She promised they were investigating. Then she said something that made my blood freeze. She said she heard her own name on the broadcast. Linda Pierce, police station, February 19th, 11:58 p.m. Cerebral hemorrhage, sudden, fatal. Her voice cracked when she told me. She was trying to sound professional, but I could hear the fear underneath. She said she had to go. Other calls coming in. The whole town was hearing this broadcast. Everyone was panicking. I tried other stations. Every AM frequency in range was carrying the same signal. The voice, the static, the death predictions. I turned on the television. Local news was already covering it. The anchor looked shaken. He confirmed that Nome's transmitter had been compromised by an unknown source. All attempts to locate or stop the broadcast had failed. The voice continued through the night. By midnight, it had listed 143 people, 10% of Nome's population, all with specific death times scattered throughout February 19th. The earliest was 6:14 a.m. The latest was 11:59 p.m. Mine was scheduled for 3:47 a.m. In less than 4 hours. I couldn't stay in the motel. If the prediction was true, if ice was somehow going to fall from a clear sky and crush me, I needed to be somewhere else. Anywhere else. I grabbed my coat and went outside. The cold hit like a physical force. 42 below now. The air was so dry it hurt to breathe. The sky was perfectly clear. Stars scattered across black like broken glass. No clouds. No moisture. No possible source of falling ice. I got in my truck and drove. No destination. Just away from the motel. The streets were nearly empty, but I saw a few other vehicles. Other people running from their predicted death locations. Trying to outsmart fate. I drove past Margaret Sullivan's house on Front Street. Lights on. She was awake. I wondered if she heard the broadcast. If she knew the voice had scheduled her death for 9:15 a.m. 7 hours away. I drove past the police station. Linda Pierce was probably still at her desk, answering phones, trying to calm a terrified town while knowing she had less than 24 hours to live. I drove to the edge of town and parked at a scenic overlook. Sat there with the engine running, heater blasting, watching the digital clock on my dashboard tick toward 3:47 a.m. 3:30, 16 minutes left. 3:40, 6 minutes. 3:45. 2 minutes. I was miles from the motel, miles from any building, out in the open with nothing above me but clear sky and stars. Whatever the voice had predicted couldn't happen here. 3:47 a.m. I held my breath, waited. Nothing happened. Seconds passed. 1 minute. 2 minutes. I was still alive, still breathing. The prediction was wrong. It was all bullshit. Some elaborate hoax that had terrorized an entire town for nothing. I laughed. Actually laughed out loud from relief and residual adrenaline. I grabbed my radio to call the motel, tell whoever was covering my shift that I could be back soon. Then I heard the crack. Not from above, from below, the ice beneath my truck. I parked on a scenic overlook that extended over the frozen harbor. The platform was supposedly stable, reinforced, safe even in the worst conditions. But the cold had done something to the supports. Stress fractures, weaknesses that had been growing all winter. The platform collapsed. My truck dropped 20 feet onto the harbor ice below. The impact shattered the windshield and threw me against the steering wheel. Pain exploded through my skull. Warm blood ran down my face. I tried to move, couldn't. Everything was wrong, broken. I looked up through the broken windshield at the clear night sky. Stars spinning, getting dimmer. I died at 3:49 a.m. 2 minutes late. Close enough, but getting ahead of myself. That is not how this story actually went. Because that is not how it actually ended. Let me tell you what really happened. At 3:47 a.m., I was sitting in my truck at the overlook, and nothing happened. The ice held. The truck stayed stable. The sky remained clear. The prediction failed. I drove back to Nome as the sun started its brief winter appearance. The town was quiet, tense, waiting for 6:14 a.m. The first predicted death. I listened to the radio. The voice was still broadcasting, still listing names and times. But now it was repeating, going through the list again. The same 143 people. The same death times. 6:14 a.m. came and went. I waited for news, for emergency vehicles, for something. Nothing happened. 9:15 a.m. Margaret Sullivan, the scheduled time. I drove past her house. She was in her front window, looking out, very much alive. 2:33 p.m. David Chen. This time, I was at his hardware store buying batteries. He was behind the counter, healthy, unharmed, no vehicular accident, no broken neck. As the day progressed and none of the predictions came true, the town began to relax. It had been a hoax after all, an elaborate, cruel prank that had terrified everyone but ultimately meant nothing. The voice continued broadcasting, but people started ignoring it, turning it off, getting back to normal life. By midnight, all 143 predicted deaths had passed. Everyone was still alive. The broadcast continued for another hour, then stopped at 1 a.m. on February 20th. Just stopped. The static cut off. Normal programming resumed on Nome. The FCC investigated but never found the source of the hijacked signal. No arrests were made. The incident was written off as a sophisticated hoax by someone with technical knowledge and a twisted sense of humor. Life returned to normal in Nome. People made jokes about it. The day nothing happened. The doomsday broadcast that cried wolf. But then people started dying. Not on February 19th. Later, weeks later, months later, but always at the exact times the voice had specified. Always in the exact manner described. Margaret Sullivan died on March 4th. Her furnace malfunctioned during the night. Carbon monoxide poisoning. She didn't wake up. The time of death was listed as 9:15 a.m. The same time the voice had predicted, just 2 weeks late. David Chen died on March 19th. Exactly 1 month after his predicted date. He hit black ice on 2nd Avenue and crashed into a utility pole. Broken neck. Instantaneous. Time of death. 2:33 p.m. Linda Pierce died on April 18th. 2 months late. Cerebral hemorrhage at her desk in the police station. Sudden. Fatal. Time of death. 11:58 p.m. One by one, the people named in the broadcast died. Always matching their predicted manner of death. Always at their predicted time. Just not on their predicted date. The voice had gotten the what and the when right. It had just been off on the which day. By December 1978, 97 of the 143 named people were dead. All died exactly as described. All at the exact time specified. Just scattered across the following months instead of all happening on one day. I am writing this in February 1979, 1 year after the broadcast. I am one of the 46 people named who are still alive. I've been waiting for my death for 12 months, waiting for 3:47 a.m. to arrive and bring blunt force trauma from falling ice. I tried to avoid it, changed my routines, stayed indoors at 3:47 a.m. every night, moved to a different apartment with no ice on the roof, taken every precaution I could think of. But I know it's coming. I can see what happened to the others. The deaths, Aaron, the accidents, the reappointments. The voice made an appointment for me. And one day, I'm going to keep it. Maybe tonight, maybe next month, maybe next year. But eventually, 3:47 a.m. will arrive, and ice will fall from somewhere, somehow, and I'll die exactly as predicted. The worst part, the waiting. It's the certainty. I know how I'm going to die. I know when. I just don't know which day. And that uncertainty is worse than any monster. Worse than any supernatural threat. Because every morning I wake up is just another morning closer to the 3:47 a.m. that is waiting for me. 32 people are left. 32 out of 143. We call each other sometimes the survivors. They formed a sort of morbid support group. We compare notes, share strategies for avoiding our predicted deaths. But deep down, we all know it's futile. The voice on the radio knew when we would die. It knew how, and one by one, we were proving it right. I think about that night a lot. The broadcast, the hijack signal, the calm voice listing deaths like items on a shopping list. Where did it come from? Who sent it? Was it trying to warn us or just informing us of the inevitable? I don't. They have answers. None of us do. All I know is that somewhere out there, something knows the future. Something knows exactly when and how we're all going to die. And for 143 people in Nome, Alaska, it decided to share that information. I wish it hadn't. I wish I never heard my name on that broadcast. I wish I could live without knowing that 3:47 a.m. is hunting me. That somewhere in my future, ice is falling, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. The clock is ticking. Every day, every hour, every 3:47 a.m. that passes without incident is just another false alarm. Another reprieve. Another chance for hope that maybe the voice was wrong about me. But it wasn't wrong about Margaret, or David, or Linda, or 94 others. Why would it be wrong about me? So I wait, and I watch the clock. And every morning at 3:47 a.m., I hold my breath and pray for 3:48. One day, that prayer won't be answered. One day, the ice will fall. Would you want to know how and when you were going to die? Would you try to change it? Or would you accept it? If a voice on the radio told you your death was scheduled, would you run or would you wait? Tell me in the comments what you would do. The stories fade, but Alaska's cold breath lingers, chilling more than just skin. If you haven't subscribed, now's the time, and turn on notifications, because the next shadow always comes sooner than expected. Tell me where you're listening from, or share your own strange encounter. Here at Vesper Shroud, the fire never dies, and the night never ends. Until we meet again, listen closely, because the silence might already be listening back.